The summer heat in Charleston, South Carolina, had always been thick and heavy, much like the unspoken tension growing in the Johnson household. The Johnson family lived in a quiet, picturesque neighborhood where well-maintained lawns and smiling neighbors gave the illusion of tranquility. But behind the doors of their beautiful two-story home, things were far from peaceful. Layla Johnson, a 35-year-old schoolteacher, had once been the epitome of happiness. She was intelligent, warm-hearted, and her soft smile could light up a room. She had always been the kind of woman who was admired by her friends and colleagues, someone who seemingly had it all: a stable career, a loving husband, and a beautiful home. But appearances were deceiving, and as the years passed, she began to feel the weight of something missing. Her husband, Michael Johnson, a 40-year-old software engineer, had always been devoted to his work. He was the strong, silent type, intellectual, hardworking, but distant. His quiet demeanor was initially what had attracted Layla to him. She found his calm presence soothing. But over time, his dedication to his career became a barrier in their relationship. Michael's workdays grew longer, and the once vibrant connection between them faded into a routine of polite exchanges and fleeting affection. It wasn't that Michael didn't love Layla. He did, deeply. But somewhere along the way, his ability to show it got lost in the endless sea of deadlines, meetings, and business trips. Layla, meanwhile, felt her emotional needs slipping further and further out of reach. She craved the intimacy and affection that had once been the foundation of their relationship. She missed the late-night talks, the playful touches, and the spontaneous gestures of love. Now, she was left feeling like a ghost in her own marriage, unseen and unheard. It was during this time of emotional turmoil that Wesley Scott re-entered her life. Wesley, a family friend, had always been around. He and Michael had met years ago through mutual friends, and he had been a fixture at their family gatherings ever since. At 40 years old, Wesley was everything Michael wasn't: charming, sociable, and attentive. As a real estate agent, he had a natural gift for making people feel special. He knew how to turn a casual conversation into something more meaningful, how to listen in a way that made you feel understood. To Layla, Wesley was a breath of fresh air. He seemed to see her in a way that Michael no longer did. He noticed the little things: her new haircut, the way she dressed for the day, the stress she carried on her shoulders. He made her feel alive again, like a woman who was desired and appreciated. Their friendship, which had always been innocent, began to take on a new shape. It started with casual conversations. Wesley would drop by the house when Michael was working late, offering to help with small tasks or just to keep her company. They would sit in the kitchen, sharing a glass of wine and talking about life, work, and everything in between. Layla found herself laughing more, feeling lighter, like she was rediscovering a part of herself that had been buried for years. But there was an undeniable undercurrent of tension between them, a spark that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. Wesley's compliments grew more frequent, more personal. He would tell her how beautiful she looked, how lucky Michael was to have her, how any man would be crazy not to shower her with affection. Layla blushed at his words, but they stirred something inside her, a longing she hadn't felt in a long time. Despite the growing attraction, Layla told herself it was harmless. After all, Wesley was a family friend, someone Michael trusted. But as the weeks passed, the boundaries of their friendship blurred. Their conversations became more intimate, their glances lingered a little too long, and the tension between them grew more intense. One evening, after a particularly emotional day, Layla found herself feeling more alone than ever. Michael had come home late again, barely acknowledging her before retreating to his home office to work. The loneliness was unbearable, and without thinking, she texted Wesley. "Can you come over? I just need someone to talk to," she wrote, her fingers trembling as she hit send. Wesley replied almost immediately, "I'm on my way." When he arrived, Layla felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They sat on the back porch, the warm summer breeze brushing against their skin as they talked about everything and nothing. But tonight, the conversation took a more vulnerable turn. Layla, her defenses worn down, began to open up about her feelings of isolation, her frustration with Michael's absence, and the growing emptiness she felt inside. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Like I'm just going through the motions every day and no one even notices." Wesley looked at her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You deserve better, Layla," he said softly. "You're an incredible woman. Any man would be lucky to have you. Michael doesn't realize what he has." His words were like a balm to her wounded heart, and in that moment, the distance between them disappeared. Wesley reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. The gesture was simple, but it was enough to ignite the spark that had been smoldering between them for weeks. Without thinking, they leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt both inevitable and shocking. It was a kiss filled with unspoken desire, with all the longing and passion that had been building between them. When they finally pulled away, Layla's heart raced, her mind spinning with the implications of what they had just done. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and the guilt washed over her like a tidal wave. "I can't," she whispered, pulling away. "This is wrong, I'm married." But Wesley wasn't deterred. He stepped closer, his voice low and persuasive. "No one has to know, Layla. We can keep this between us. I care about you. I just want to make you happy." His words, his presence, the way he made her feel, it was intoxicating. And in that moment, Layla made a choice that would change everything. As the days in Charleston stretched long and hot, Layla Johnson found herself caught in a dangerous game she never imagined she'd play. The kiss she shared with Wesley Scott haunted her, replaying in her mind when she woke up in the morning, when she went about her daily tasks, and especially when she lay in bed next to Michael, who seemed oblivious to the emotional storm brewing inside her. The rational part of her knew she should stop whatever had begun with Wesley. But the more emotional part, the part of her that had been starved of affection, attention, and connection for so long, couldn't bring itself to break away. Wesley made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. His presence lit a fire in her, one that she was afraid would burn out if she walked away. In the days following their kiss, Layla tried to avoid Wesley, keeping herself busy with work and family obligations. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, she found herself thinking about him. She caught herself looking at her phone, waiting for a text from him, hoping for a reason to see him again. And then it came. It was a simple message. "Dinner tonight? Just us." Her heart skipped a beat as she read it. Her mind raced with excuses. She could say she was busy, that she had plans with Michael, that it was a bad idea. But instead, her fingers moved almost on their own, typing out a reply. Yes. That evening, Layla stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She had chosen a dress that was simple but elegant, something that could be passed off as casual, but had a hint of allure. As she applied her makeup, her hands trembled slightly, a mix of excitement and guilt swirling inside her. When she arrived at the restaurant, Wesley was already there, waiting for her. He stood as she approached, flashing her the same charming smile that had disarmed her the first time they met. He pulled out her chair, a gesture that felt both gallant and intimate, and as she sat down, she realized just how dangerous this situation had become. Over dinner, their conversation flowed easily, as it always did. But there was an unspoken tension between them, a current of electricity that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. Wesley complimented her, as he always did, telling her how beautiful she looked, how much he admired her strength and grace. His words were like a balm to her wounded heart, soothing the loneliness and neglect she had felt for so long. But as the night wore on, Layla began to notice something different about Wesley. There was a possessiveness in the way he looked at her, a subtle hint of control in the way he steered their conversation. At first, it was almost imperceptible, the way he chose the wine without asking, the way he casually mentioned that he didn't like her spending too much time with certain friends. It was all said with a smile, in a way that felt like he was just looking out for her. But the more he spoke, the more Layla realized that this wasn't just concern. It was something darker. Wesley had always been charming, but now there was an edge to it, something that made her uneasy. After dinner, they walked along the waterfront, the moon casting a silvery glow over the water. Wesley took her hand, pulling her close as they walked, and Layla found herself torn between the thrill of his touch and the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. "You know," Wesley said softly, his voice low and smooth. I've never met anyone like you, Layla. You're everything I've ever wanted, and I don't plan on letting you slip away." His words sent a shiver down her spine, but not in the way they had before. There was something possessive in his tone, something that hinted at a level of obsession she hadn't seen in him before. "Wesley, this is—" She paused, unsure of how to finish her sentence. "This is complicated." "It doesn't have to be," he said, stopping to face her. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch both tender and commanding. "We could have something real, Layla. Something better than what you have with Michael." Her heart raced, her mind spinning. She had wanted to hear those words. She had craved the attention, the affection, the romance. But now, standing there with Wesley, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something dangerous. "I don't know," she whispered, stepping back. I can't hurt Michael like this." But Wesley wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his voice growing more insistent. "He doesn't deserve you, Layla. You deserve to be with someone who sees you, who values you. Someone like me." As he spoke, Layla felt the tension between them shift. What had once been romantic and thrilling now felt suffocating. The possessiveness in his voice, the way he was looking at her, it all felt wrong. "I think I should go," she said, her voice trembling. But Wesley didn't let go. His grip on her wrist tightened, and for the first time, Layla felt a flash of fear. His charming facade was slipping, revealing something darker beneath. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The next morning, Layla woke up in her bed, her mind foggy with confusion. The events of the previous night played in her mind like a fragmented dream. She remembered walking with Wesley, the way his demeanor had changed, the fear that had gripped her when he wouldn't let her go. But after that, everything was a blur. Had she imagined it? Had she overreacted? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that something had shifted between them, something that she couldn't ignore. For the next few days, Layla avoided Wesley. She ignored his texts, dodged his calls, and threw herself into her work, trying to forget the unsettling turn their relationship had taken. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that Wesley wasn't done with her. And she was right. The days following her last encounter with Wesley felt like a waking nightmare for Layla Johnson. Though she tried to return to normal, teaching her students, attending social events, and spending time with Michael, the memory of that night haunted her. Wesley's shift in demeanor from charming to controlling lingered in her mind like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. She told herself over and over again that she needed to end it. Whatever brief affair had sparked between them needed to be extinguished before it consumed her completely. But Layla was afraid not just of Wesley, but of what ending things might provoke. He had already shown glimpses of his darker side, his need for control, his possessiveness. Cutting him off could make things worse. Layla did what she could to avoid him. She changed her routine. No more late-night meetings, no more chance encounters at the coffee shop where they used to sit and talk for hours. She hoped Wesley would get the message, that he would back off, let her reclaim the life she had almost destroyed. But Wesley was not the type of man to give up so easily. It started subtly, almost unnoticeable at first. A text message here and there. "I miss you, Layla. Don't shut me out. We need to talk." And then, "I can't let you just disappear." She tried to ignore them, but with each day, his messages grew more persistent, more insistent. Layla began to feel like she was being watched, though she could never pinpoint why. It was just a feeling, like an unseen presence following her everywhere she went. Her phone buzzed with notifications from Wesley, his words growing more erratic, more demanding. "You can't hide from me. You're mine, Layla." The words chilled her to the bone, and for the first time, she felt a genuine fear that she couldn't shake. She knew she had made a mistake getting involved with Wesley, but she hadn't expected it to spiral out of control like this. The romantic excitement she once felt was long gone, replaced with a growing sense of dread. At home, Michael had begun to notice the changes in her behavior. Layla, once so vibrant and open, had become more withdrawn, more distant. She spent more time alone, her phone never leaving her side, and she always seemed on edge, jumping whenever it buzzed. One night, as they sat at the dinner table, Michael couldn't hold back any longer. "Layla, what's going on with you?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. "You've been acting strange, distant. Is everything okay?" Layla froze, her fork hovering over her plate. She hadn't been prepared for this conversation, hadn't expected Michael to notice how much she was struggling to keep it together. She quickly forced a smile, shaking her head. "I'm fine, just stressed from work, that's all." But Michael wasn't convinced. His eyes, usually focused on his work, were now locked onto her, searching for the truth. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You can tell me if something's wrong," he said softly. "We're supposed to be in this together." Her heart twisted with guilt. Michael had always been a good man, devoted and hardworking. He didn't deserve this, didn't deserve to be kept in the dark. But Layla couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth, not yet. Not when she was still trying to figure out how to untangle herself from Wesley's grip. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I'm just tired. I'll be okay." But Michael's instincts told him there was more to the story. He had always been a man who paid attention to details, small things others might overlook. And lately, the details in Layla's life didn't add up. That night, as Layla slept, Michael stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't push away. He hadn't been paying attention to his marriage. He realized that now. His job had taken over his life, leaving Layla to fend for herself emotionally. But something else was going on, something that went beyond the usual stress of life. When Layla's phone buzzed on the nightstand next to her, Michael glanced over, his curiosity getting the better of him. The screen lit up, and in that brief moment, he saw a name that made his blood run cold. Wesley Scott. Why was Wesley texting his wife? Careful not to wake Layla, Michael reached for the phone. The message was simple: "We need to talk." But the implications were anything but. Why was Wesley texting her so late at night? And why did the tone of the message feel so urgent? The next morning, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had always trusted Wesley. After all, he had been a family friend for years. But now, Michael couldn't help but feel like he had been blindsided by something he didn't see coming. His mind raced with questions. Was it possible that Layla and Wesley had... No, he couldn't let himself think that. He had always trusted Layla implicitly, but the evidence was mounting and Michael couldn't ignore it any longer. For the next few days, Michael kept a close eye on Layla. He watched how she reacted to her phone, the way she seemed tense whenever it buzzed, the way she avoided his questions about where she had been or who she was talking to. It wasn't long before Michael's suspicions were confirmed. One evening, as Layla stepped out to run errands, Michael followed her. He had never done anything like this before, but the growing knot in his stomach told him he had no choice. He needed to know the truth. From a distance, he watched as Layla parked her car near the waterfront, where Wesley was waiting for her. They met with an embrace that was far too intimate for friends, and Michael felt his heart sink. He had been right. His wife was having an affair with Wesley. The confrontation that followed was inevitable. That night, after Layla returned home, Michael sat her down in the living room, his face pale and drawn with hurt and anger. "I know about you and Wesley," he said, his voice shaking with the effort to stay calm. Layla felt the blood drain from her face. "Michael, Don't lie to me," he cut her off, his voice rising. I saw you with him." Tears welled up in Layla's eyes, and she couldn't hold back any longer. She confessed to everything: the emotional affair, the growing tension with Wesley, and the way it had spiraled out of control. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. I felt so alone, and he was there for me." Michael's hands clenched into fists, his anger barely contained. "How could you do this to me? To us?" "I'm sorry," Layla whispered, her voice broken. "I never wanted to hurt you." But the damage had been done, and Michael couldn't unsee what he had witnessed. The betrayal cut deep, and despite Layla's tearful apologies, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was looming on the horizon. And he was right. The weeks that followed Michael's discovery were unbearable. The air in the Johnson household was thick with tension, each day feeling like a slow, painful descent into something darker and more dangerous. Michael couldn't bring himself to look at Layla the same way. The betrayal had lodged itself deep in his chest, a wound that festered with every passing moment. He couldn't shake the image of her in Wesley's arms, the man he had trusted as a friend. Layla, on the other hand, felt like she was drowning. Her guilt consumed her. She hadn't meant for things to go this far. What had started as a brief escape from the loneliness of her marriage had spiraled into a nightmare. She tried to talk to Michael, to mend the damage she had done, but each attempt was met with cold silence or sharp words. She knew she had hurt him deeply, but the cracks in their relationship seemed irreparable now. But it wasn't just Michael she was worried about. Wesley, once so charming and attentive, had grown increasingly erratic. His texts became more insistent, more desperate. He demanded to see her, to talk to her, to continue what they had started. "I won't let this end like this," one of his messages read. "You're mine, Layla. You belong with me." Those words sent a chill down her spine. There was something dangerous in his tone now, something possessive and unsettling. She had tried to distance herself from him, but it was becoming clear that Wesley wasn't going to let go so easily. The situation had become volatile, and Layla was terrified of what he might do next. One evening, when Michael had gone out for a late-night drive to clear his head, Layla sat in the living room, her mind racing. She hadn't heard from Wesley in days, and while a part of her was relieved, another part couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She couldn't explain it, but the sense of dread hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Her heart leaped in her chest as she stood up, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't been expecting anyone. As she cautiously approached the door, she peeked through the window and felt her stomach drop. It was Wesley. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether to open the door, but before she could make a decision, he knocked again, harder this time. "Layla, I know you're in there." His voice came through the door, low and insistent. "We need to talk." Taking a deep breath, Layla opened the door, hoping to keep the situation calm. Wesley stood there, his eyes wide with a manic energy she hadn't seen before. There was something unsettling in his gaze, a frantic desperation that made her skin crawl. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaky but firm. "We need to talk," he repeated, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Layla instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "There's nothing left to talk about, Wesley," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's over. Whatever this was, it's over." But Wesley didn't seem to hear her. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair, his eyes darting around as if searching for something. There was a wildness to him now, a loss of control that frightened her. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low but filled with intensity. "We were supposed to be together. I love you, Layla. You're mine. You can't just walk away." Layla's stomach tightened in fear. She had never seen him like this before. Wesley had always been charming, always in control, but now he seemed unhinged. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice firmer now, though her hands trembled. "You need to leave, Wesley. This isn't healthy." But Wesley wasn't listening. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes burning with intensity. "I did everything for you," he said, his voice rising. "I gave you everything and you're just going to throw it away? For what? For him? He doesn't deserve you, Layla. He never did." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Layla took another step back, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to diffuse the situation. Wesley was too close now, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. "I think you need help, Wesley," she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm. "Please, just leave. We can talk about this later, but right now you need to go." But Wesley didn't budge, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body trembling with barely contained rage. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to Layla. "No," he said, his voice cold and flat. "I'm not leaving, not until you understand." Layla's heart raced. She knew she needed to get out, but before she could make a move, the door suddenly swung open. Michael stood in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and anger as he took in the scene. Layla standing frozen in fear, Wesley towering over her, his face twisted with rage. "What the hell is going on here?" Michael demanded, his voice sharp. Wesley turned slowly to face him, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're the reason she's like this," he spat. "You never deserved her. You were never enough." Without warning, Wesley lunged at Michael, his fists swinging wildly. The two men collided, and the room erupted into chaos. Layla screamed, backing away as they grappled, knocking over furniture and sending picture frames crashing to the floor. The fight was brutal, raw. Michael, though blindsided, fought back with everything he had, but Wesley was relentless, fueled by his obsession. The sound of fists landing echoed through the room, and for a moment, it seemed like neither man would stop. But then it happened. In the frenzy of the struggle, Wesley reached into his jacket and pulled out something that Layla couldn't fully see in the chaos. Before she could comprehend what was happening, there was a sudden, sickening sound, a sharp gasp of pain from Michael, followed by a chilling silence. Time seemed to slow. Layla stood frozen, her mind unable to process what she had just witnessed. Wesley stepped back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a twisted mixture of triumph and horror. Michael collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the ragged breathing of the man who had just committed the unthinkable. Layla couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her body felt paralyzed with shock, her mind refusing to accept what had just happened. The man she had shared her life with, the man she had betrayed, lay bleeding on the floor, his life slipping away with every passing second. And Wesley, standing over him, seemed just as shocked by his own actions. The minutes that followed felt like a blur. Layla finally found her voice, her hands shaking as she dialed 911, her words frantic and barely coherent. "Please, someone, there's been an accident. My husband, he's hurt. Please hurry." The operator's voice was calm, but Layla barely heard it over the pounding of her own heart. She dropped the phone and sank to her knees beside Michael, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to hold on to him. But Michael's eyes were already glazing over, his breaths shallow and labored. "I'm sorry," Layla whispered, her tears falling onto his shirt. "I'm so sorry." The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, but in that moment, it felt like they were a lifetime away. The night of Michael's death left the quiet neighborhood of Charleston in stunned silence. By the time the police arrived, the scene inside the Johnson household had transformed into a chilling crime scene. Blood pooling beneath Michael's still body, furniture overturned, and shattered glass scattered across the floor like remnants of a broken life. The flashing lights of police cars and the murmurs of concerned neighbors only amplified the surreal horror of it all. Layla sat frozen on the floor beside her husband, her hands stained with blood as she cradled his body, her eyes distant and unfocused. Her world had collapsed in the span of minutes, and all she could hear was the incessant ringing of sirens and the disjointed fragments of police voices as they moved around the house. She had known Wesley was dangerous, but she hadn't realized just how far his obsession had driven him. And now Michael, the man she had once loved and betrayed, was gone, his life brutally cut short in a way she never could have imagined. The following days passed in a blur. The police quickly arrested Wesley, who had made no attempt to flee. He seemed almost detached as they led him away in handcuffs, his expression blank, as though he was only now beginning to comprehend the gravity of his actions. Layla could barely stand to look at him. The man who had once made her feel alive, desired, and loved had revealed himself to be a monster, twisted by his obsession and need for control. The investigation moved swiftly. The detectives who handled the case were seasoned, their eyes cold and professional as they examined the scene, piecing together the events that had led to Michael's death. Detective Marcus Blake, a tall, stoic man with a sharp mind for detail, led the investigation. His presence was commanding, his questions precise and calculated. As Layla sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, Detective Blake sat across from her, his notepad resting on the table between them. He had heard countless stories of love gone wrong, of affairs spiraling into violence, but something about this case struck him differently. The calmness with which Wesley had committed the crime, the obsessive nature of his relationship with Layla, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple crime of passion. "Tell me about Wesley," Detective Blake said, his voice steady. "How long had you been seeing him?" Layla swallowed hard, her throat dry. She hadn't eaten or slept in days, and the weight of her guilt felt like a crushing burden she could barely carry. "It started a few months ago," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to happen. He was just there, when Michael wasn't, and I was lonely." Blake nodded, his expression unreadable. He had heard similar stories before, but the chilling calm with which Wesley had attacked Michael still unsettled him. "Did you know about his tendencies?" "Tendencies?" Layla repeated, confused. The detective leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We found some disturbing evidence at Wesley's apartment. Diaries, photos, writings. It seems Wesley has a long history of obsession, control, dominance. Fetishes that go beyond what most people would consider normal." Layla felt her stomach churn. She had known Wesley had a controlling side, but she hadn't realized just how deep it ran. The thought that she had been involved with someone capable of such darkness made her feel sick. "We also found letters," Blake continued, his tone growing more serious. "Letters he wrote to you but never sent. Obsessive letters, detailing how he would take care of you, how no one else deserved you. He's been planning this for longer than you think." The words hit Layla like a sledgehammer. Wesley had been planning this? The affair, the manipulation, it had all been part of his twisted game, his attempt to isolate her, to control her, and she had fallen right into his trap. "I didn't know," Layla whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear I didn't know." The trial of Wesley Scott was swift and brutal. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The diaries, the letters, the crime scene itself, it all painted a picture of a man who had slowly unraveled, consumed by his obsession with Layla. The prosecution argued that Wesley had been stalking her long before the affair even began, biding his time until he could manipulate her into his control. The courtroom was packed with reporters, friends, and family members, all eager to hear the details of the scandal that had rocked their quiet community. Layla sat in the front row, her face pale and drawn, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she listened to the prosecutor lay out Wesley's crimes. Every word felt like another blow, another reminder of how deeply she had misjudged the man she thought she had known. When Wesley took the stand, his demeanor was chilling. He didn't deny what he had done. He didn't even seem to fully comprehend the horror of his actions. He spoke in a detached, almost clinical way about how he had loved Layla, how he believed she had belonged to him, and how Michael had stood in the way of their happiness. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he said, his voice calm, as though he were discussing something trivial. "But Michael didn't deserve her. He was just in the way." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The judge's expression was one of disbelief, his gavel slamming down as he sentenced Wesley to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the case, but for Layla, the damage was done. In the weeks that followed, Layla struggled to rebuild her life. The house felt empty without Michael, haunted by memories of what they once had and the choices that had led to his death. The guilt was a constant weight on her chest, a reminder that her actions had set the wheels in motion for the tragedy that had unfolded. But more than that, Layla was left with the haunting realization that she had been manipulated, used by a man who had seen her vulnerability and exploited it for his own twisted needs. Wesley's obsession had destroyed everything she had held dear, and she knew that no amount of time would erase the scars he had left on her life. She tried to find some sense of normalcy, returning to her job, trying to rebuild the relationships she had neglected, but nothing felt the same. She had lost Michael, not just to Wesley, but to her own choices, and that was a weight she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The investigation into Wesley's past continued long after the trial ended, uncovering more disturbing truths about his history of manipulation and control. He had done this before, pursued women, isolated them, convinced them they were loved, only to reveal his darker nature when things didn't go his way. Layla had been just another victim in his twisted game, though she hadn't realized it until it was too late. But the damage had been done. Michael was gone, and Layla was left to pick up the pieces of the life that had been shattered by her affair, by Wesley's obsession, and by the violence that had stolen her husband from her. The quiet streets of Charleston would never feel the same again, not for her. And as she stood at Michael's grave, her hands trembling, the weight of it all finally settled on her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered. her voice barely audible over the breeze. "I'm so sorry." But the wind carried her words away, and the only answer she received was the silence of the world she had lost.